What would you do if someone walked into your yard every morning, spread out a mat, and treated it like their personal gym, without ever asking for permission? At first, Malcolm didn't think much of it. The first time he saw Karen stretching on his driveway, he assumed it was a one-time thing. Maybe she needed extra space. Maybe she was avoiding the uneven pavement in front of her own house. It was early in the morning, the sun barely rising over the quiet cul-de-sac, and he figured it was none of his business. He let it go. But then it happened again. And again. Before he knew it, Karen had made his driveway her yoga studio. Every morning, like clockwork, she unrolled her mat, took a deep breath, and began her routine, right on his property. Not near it. Not next to it. On it. She didn't ask. She didn't even acknowledge the fact that she was intruding. To her, it was just another day of self-care. To Malcolm, it was a blatant invasion of space. At first, he tried to be polite. The first time he mentioned it, he kept his voice light, casual. "Hey, Karen, you mind using your own driveway for this?" Karen barely looked up from her pose, her voice airy and dismissive. "Oh, don't be so uptight, Malcolm. It's just yoga." The next day, he tried again, adding a little more firmness to his tone. "Karen, seriously, this is my driveway. You need to do this somewhere else." She just laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, come on," she said with a smirk. "You're making a big deal out of nothing." That was the moment Malcolm realized she wasn't just unaware, she didn't care. She had decided that his property was hers to use however she pleased. And the worst part? She didn't see anything wrong with it. Malcolm had dealt with entitled people before, but there was something about Karen's particular brand of arrogance that made his blood simmer. It wasn't just that she used his driveway, it was the way she dismissed him every time he spoke, as if his words held no weight, as if his requests were mere suggestions she could ignore at will. It was the way she smirked while rolling up her yoga mat, giving him a look that all but said, "What are you going to do about it?" And Malcolm, always a man of patience, had held back. Until now. That morning, as Karen stretched her arms toward the sky, standing firmly on his pavement, Malcolm walked outside, jaw set, arms crossed. "Karen," he said, voice steady, "I've asked you more than once. You're on my property. This needs to stop." She sighed, dramatically, like he was a nuisance. "Malcolm, I don't understand why you're so hostile about this." "Hostile? Hostile?" He clenched his fists, willing himself to stay calm. "I'm not being hostile. I'm asking you to respect my space." Karen put a hand on her hip, the other flicking her blonde ponytail over her shoulder. "You need to relax. Maybe you should try yoga, might help with that tension." She rolled her eyes, already going back into a pose, as if the conversation was over. Malcolm could feel it now, the simmering frustration bubbling under the surface. He had played it nice. He had given her more than enough chances. Clearly, she wasn't going to stop. But if she thought he was going to let this go, she was dead wrong. Later that afternoon, just as he was preparing to draft a formal complaint to the HOA, he found something in his mailbox. A letter. From the HOA. His stomach twisted as he opened it, eyes scanning the page. "Dear Mr. Carter. It has come to our attention that there have been multiple complaints regarding your behavior toward a fellow resident. Several reports have indicated that your actions have made a neighbor feel uncomfortable and unsafe. We take these matters seriously. Please be advised that further complaints may result in fines or additional action." Malcolm exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the paper. What the hell was this? Karen had beaten him to the punch. Somehow, she had turned the situation around on him, framing herself as the victim. She was the one trespassing on his property every morning, and yet, he was the one getting a warning? The audacity made his skin burn with rage. And then he saw it, the little HOA signature at the bottom. Karen was on the HOA board. Of course she was. Now it all made sense. She didn't just think she could do whatever she wanted, she knew she could get away with it. Malcolm stormed back inside, tossing the letter onto his desk. He could already imagine Karen's smug smile as she filed the complaint, spinning some ridiculous tale about how he had been aggressive or intimidating while she was just trying to find peace in her own neighborhood. This wasn't just about yoga anymore. This was about power. She had weaponized the HOA against him, twisting the system to her advantage, knowing full well that the perception of a black man harassing a white woman would work in her favor. Malcolm could have raged. He could have shouted. But he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of reacting the way she expected him to. Instead, he took a deep breath. If Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one, but not on her terms. That night, Malcolm began his own plan. He pulled up his security footage, scrolling back to the mornings when Karen had blatantly walked onto his driveway, stretched, laughed, and dismissed him. He saved the videos. Dated them. Logged every single instance where he had asked her to stop. Then, he reached out to his neighbors. And that's when he discovered something even bigger. Karen had done this before. Not with yoga, but with everything else. Malcolm wasn't the first. That realization hit him like a ton of bricks as he spoke with his neighbors. At first, it started small, casual conversations with those who lived nearby. A question slipped into a friendly chat. Had they ever dealt with Karen pulling something similar? Had she ever overstepped with them? And the responses came faster and louder than he expected. The elderly couple 3 houses down had been her first victims. They'd lived in the neighborhood for nearly 2 decades, their home a modest but well-kept place with a soft blue exterior. Karen, with her self-proclaimed high standards, had decided the shade of their house was an eyesore. For months, she pestered them through anonymous HOA complaints, claiming their paint color lowered the property value and was non-compliant with neighborhood aesthetics. When the couple refused to repaint it, fines started arriving, hundreds of dollars in so-called violations that had mysteriously appeared the moment Karen was elected to the HOA board. In the end, they gave up, repainted, and stayed quiet. Then there was Lisa, a single mother raising 2 kids. She had bought her house with every dime she had, finally giving her children a stable home. The problem? She had put a small play set in the backyard, nothing fancy, just a swing set and a slide. Karen had hated it. She called it unsightly, complained it was against HOA policy, which, Malcolm later confirmed, was a lie, and harassed Lisa with official letters until she was forced to remove it. Lisa's kids had cried for weeks. And that was just the beginning. The deeper Malcolm dug, the clearer the pattern became. Karen didn't just abuse the HOA, she controlled it. For years, she had used her position to target specific homeowners, pushing her own agenda under the guise of enforcing the rules. And more often than not, the people she went after were the ones she saw as lesser than her, people who didn't fit the polished, whitewashed image she wanted the neighborhood to have. She went after the elderly, knowing they wouldn't fight back. She went after single mothers, assuming they were too overwhelmed to push against her. And, as Malcolm now understood firsthand, she went after black homeowners, because she knew that if she framed things just right, the system would take her side without question. It was calculated. It was deliberate. And it wasn't just about power, it was about control. The more stories Malcolm collected, the angrier he became. This wasn't just one woman being an entitled nuisance. This was a pattern of bullying, manipulation, and abuse of authority. Karen had built her little empire within the HOA, and she had used it to make life miserable for anyone she deemed unworthy. That was the real battle. This wasn't just about her yoga mat. This was about tearing down the power structure that had allowed Karen to get away with it for so long. And Malcolm was ready. That night, he compiled every single piece of evidence he had. He organized the security footage of Karen trespassing. He collected screenshots of the HOA letters sent to him and his neighbors. He logged every fine, every fabricated violation, and every complaint Karen had ever filed against people who had simply been trying to live their lives. And then he made a plan. Karen had used the HOA to silence people. She had used fear, bureaucracy, and manipulation to make sure no one ever fought back. But Malcolm wasn't like the others. He wasn't going to repaint his house. He wasn't going to take down a swing set. And he sure as hell wasn't going to stand by while someone like Karen stole his autonomy in his own home. The time for patience was over. Now, it was his turn to fight back. Malcolm knew that confronting Karen directly would get him nowhere. She had already twisted the narrative, painting herself as a helpless woman under attack by an intimidating neighbor. No, he wouldn't give her the chance to spin another lie. He would hit her where it hurt, in front of the entire HOA and the very people she had manipulated for years. The next neighborhood HOA meeting was only a few days away, held in the community clubhouse where residents gathered for everything from policy changes to petty squabbles. Normally, these meetings were boring, concerns about lawn heights, noise complaints, and parking disputes. But this time, Malcolm had something bigger planned. Karen, ever the confident puppet master, arrived at the meeting without a care in the world. She strutted in with that smugness she always carried, greeting people like a politician working a crowd, smiling at those she deemed important while barely acknowledging those she had steamrolled over the years. She had no idea what was coming. As the meeting began, she stood up, her voice calm and measured, as if she were the reasonable one. "Before we get started," she said, her tone full of fake concern, "I'd like to address a recent situation regarding a fellow resident's hostility toward me." Her eyes flicked toward Malcolm, lips curling just slightly. "I know we all strive to keep this neighborhood peaceful, and unfortunately, I've felt unsafe in my own community because of repeated aggression." Malcolm didn't move. Didn't flinch. He let her talk. Let her weave her ridiculous tale about how he had made her feel uncomfortable in her own neighborhood. He watched as she played the victim card masterfully, twisting her voice just enough to sound fragile, as if she had barely mustered the strength to speak. When she finally sat down, looking pleased with herself, Malcolm slowly stood. "Since we're talking about maintaining peace in the community," he said, his voice steady, "I think it's time we discuss something that's been overlooked for far too long." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small remote. With a press of a button, the clubhouse's projector flickered to life, displaying a paused frame of Karen standing in his driveway, mid-stretch on her yoga mat. The room went silent. Malcolm let the image linger before pressing play. On the screen, Karen could be seen ignoring his repeated requests to leave. The audio was crisp, her dismissive tone unmistakable. "Oh, don't be so uptight, Malcolm. It's just yoga." Laughter and murmurs spread through the room. Karen's face drained of color. But Malcolm wasn't done. He clicked again, and the next clip played, Karen calling the HOA about his aggressive behavior while standing in his driveway, smirking as she exaggerated every detail. Click. Another clip. A neighbor speaking in a recorded conversation about how Karen had forced an elderly couple to repaint their house. Click. A video of Lisa, the single mother, tearing up as she recalled Karen having her children's playset removed. Click. A copy of every HOA fine Karen had ever issued under false pretenses. Karen shot to her feet. "This is completely out of context," she barked, her voice suddenly far less composed than before. Malcolm tilted his head. "Is it?" Karen's mask was cracking. The quiet murmur of the room had turned against her. Even the board members, her allies, looked uncomfortable now, shifting in their seats, realizing that they were complicit in enabling her abuses. Then came the final blow. Malcolm turned to the HOA president, a man who had mostly ignored his complaints until now. "I did some checking," he said, holding up a document. "Karen has filed over 24 complaints in the past year alone, nearly all of them against homeowners who were elderly, single parents, or people of color. Meanwhile, her own violations?" He raised an eyebrow. "Zero. Not a single infraction. Funny how that works." The HOA president didn't speak. The silence in the room was suffocating. Karen, now visibly shaking, desperately searched the room for support. But there was none. The neighbors she had once bullied refused to meet her eyes. The people she had once commanded with an iron grip now looked at her like a liability. And Malcolm stood there, calm, composed, and undeniably right. Karen had spent years manipulating the system to her advantage, thinking no one would ever fight back. But now, the whole neighborhood knew exactly who she was. Karen's downfall was swift and absolute. The silence in the room stretched unbearably as the weight of Malcolm's evidence settled over the HOA meeting like a storm cloud. The very people who once tolerated her antics, who turned a blind eye to her manipulations, now looked at her with disgust. Even the HOA board members, her so-called allies, knew they had no choice. The evidence was undeniable, and any attempt to defend her would only make them complicit. The HOA president cleared his throat, fumbling with his papers as he avoided Karen's glare. "Given the overwhelming proof presented," he said, his voice stiff with discomfort, "the board has decided to suspend Karen from all HOA activities, effective immediately. Furthermore, we will be reviewing past complaints to ensure fair enforcement of regulations moving forward." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd, some in relief, others in sheer disbelief that Karen's reign of terror was finally ending. Karen, however, was far from accepting defeat. She shot to her feet, face flushed red with fury. "This is ridiculous," she screeched, her voice cracking under the weight of her own unraveling. "You're going to listen to him? After everything I've done for this neighborhood?" No one answered. That was the moment she realized, she had lost. Karen stormed out of the meeting, but the damage was done. News of her humiliation spread like wildfire. Neighbors she had once tormented no longer hesitated to share their stories. More complaints surfaced. More people came forward. The HOA had no choice but to permanently revoke her membership, stripping her of the power she had wielded for so long. Her reputation, once built on fear and manipulation, crumbled beyond repair. Karen made one last desperate attempt to save herself, threatening to sue Malcolm for defamation. But no lawyer would take her case. The evidence was too damning, the truth too clear. With no allies left, no power, and a community that had completely turned against her, she was left with one choice. A for sale sign appeared on Karen's lawn within weeks. By the time she packed up and left, she had become a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when entitlement meets its reckoning. Neighbors barely acknowledged her departure, some even celebrating in hushed conversations. And Malcolm? For the first time in months, he stepped outside one morning to an empty driveway, no yoga mat, no smug glances, no more battles to fight. Peace had returned, but something even greater had been gained. He had proven that entitlement could be challenged, that abuse of power had consequences, and that even in the face of an unfair system, the truth could still win. But the real question is, how many more Karens are out there, getting away with it? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.